The Galactic Council ordered humanity's destruction. She said, "Let him begin." The chamber did not echo. That was the first thing that unsettled me about it. Every sound I made, every shift of my boots on the floor, every slow breath I pulled in through my nose, vanished the moment it left my body. 47 species packed into a structure the size of a mountain, and the room swallowed every sound like it had been hungry for centuries. That silence was not accidental. It was engineered. The Galactic Council had spent 60,000 years perfecting the art of making other civilizations feel small, and silence, I had learned, was one of their finest tools. I am Admiral Kale Morrow. At the time of the events I am about to describe, I was watching through a lens no larger than my thumbnail, a camera embedded in the collar of Ambassador Sierra Vance's formal white coat. I was 40 light minutes away, sitting in the command chair of a warship that the Council did not know existed, watching the woman I trusted most in the universe walk toward a podium that no human had ever stood behind before. She walked slowly, not because she was afraid. Sierra Vance had never moved slowly out of fear in her life. She walked slowly because she wanted every single delegate in that chamber to look at her. She wanted them to study her. She wanted them to think they understood what they were seeing. They did not. The charges had already been read. 7 hours of them, delivered by the UL Collective in their flat, mechanical voices. Each accusation documented and cross-referenced with the precision of a species that had never once, in recorded history, been wrong about anything. The Kepler colonies expanding beyond treaty boundaries. The Draveth Station incident, which the Council had recorded as human aggression, and which I knew, personally, began when a Draveth patrol fired on an unarmed survey crew. The human refusal to submit to population limitation protocols, which the Council framed as defiance and which we understood as survival. And then, the charge that had dropped the room into a different kind of silence entirely. Project Ares. The name had leaked 14 months before the vote. How it leaked, I still do not know with certainty. What the Council saw was enough to make 47 civilizations reach the same conclusion before a single debate was held. They did not know the full scope of what we had built. They knew only the outline of it, and the outline alone had been enough to terrify them. They voted before Sierra even reached the podium. I saw it happen in real time through her collar camera. The tally board above the central dais filled in species by species, each symbol glowing as it registered. The UL Collective, the Karath Dominion, the Vreth Assembly. One after another, the symbols lit up in the pale amber color the Council used for approval. 47 symbols, 47 civilizations. Every single one in favor of Directive Omega, the lawful, documented, procedurally approved order for the complete and permanent removal of the human species from the galaxy. They voted, and then they waited for Sierra to see it. She saw it. I watched her eyes move to the board. I watched the number settle. I watched her read it the way she read everything, completely and instantly, without any visible reaction. Then she stepped up to the podium. She stood there for 12 seconds without speaking. I counted them. In that silence, which the room swallowed as it swallowed everything else, every eye in the chamber was on her. Every sensor array of every species was trained in her direction. The Serenthi, ancient and bioluminescent, their bodies shifting through slow pulses of cold blue light, leaned forward in their high seats. The Karath, massive and armored, their translated breath coming through vents in rhythmic bursts, went still in a way that their kind rarely went still. Even the UL Collective, which had no individual bodies, seemed to compress itself, to draw its shared attention into a tighter focus. 12 seconds. Then Sierra spoke. "Before you vote," she said, and her voice carried with absolute clarity through the chamber's translation system, reaching every species in their own language, "I need you to understand what you are starting. Not asking, not requesting, not threatening. I need you to understand. Because unlike every species you have done this to before, we prepared for it." The chamber did not react the way I expected. There were no sounds of outrage, no procedural interruptions, no delegate rose to respond. They simply watched her, and in their watching, I felt something that took me a moment to identify. They were uncertain. 47 civilizations, representing the oldest and most powerful political body in the known galaxy, and a single human woman standing at their podium had introduced a variable their models had not prepared for. The vote had already passed. That was the procedure. The verdict was final. What she was doing now was not an appeal. She had said it herself. She was not asking. She was not requesting. She was informing. She held the moment for 3 more seconds, and then she turned. Not to the delegates, not to the tally board. She turned directly toward the maintenance panel on the far wall where, 11 months earlier, a human technician on a routine contract had installed a camera so small it was invisible to standard sensor sweeps. She looked into that camera. She looked, across 40 light minutes of space, directly at me. And she nodded once. "Let him begin," she said. Those were the last words Ambassador Sierra Vance spoke in the Chamber of Accord. She did not wait for a response. She stepped back from the podium, walked the length of the chamber without hurrying, and passed through a door that was not supposed to open for her. I was already giving the order before the door closed behind her. Across 14 star systems and 47 hidden locations scattered through the dark between mapped space lanes, the lights came on. The Ares fleet answered. For 31 years, humanity had known the vote was coming. That is not a guess. It is not a dramatic exaggeration constructed in hindsight to make the story feel inevitable. I know the exact date the conclusion was reached, the names of the 4 analysts who produced the report, and the precise calculation that made every subsequent decision not a choice but a logical necessity. I know these things because I was one of the 4 analysts. I was 26 years old, and I had just spent 18 months mapping the Council's behavior against every species it had contacted in the previous 10,000 years. The pattern was not hidden. It was simply large enough that you had to step back far enough to see it all at once, and most people were never willing to step back that far. Every species that had grown too quickly, every civilization that refused to be fully modeled by the Council's prediction systems, every culture that developed technology ahead of schedule or thought in ways the Council's existing frameworks could not comfortably contain. They were all gone. Not through open war, not through dramatic confrontation, but through Directive Omega, issued quietly, carried out efficiently, recorded in the Council's archives as a necessary measure for galactic stability. 11 species in 10,000 years, each one presented to the wider galaxy as a threat, each one removed before they became what the Council's models projected they might eventually become. We were going to be the 12th. The report I helped produce was classified at a level that has no public name. It went to 7 people. Within 5 years, the decision it necessitated had been made at the highest level of human government, ratified by a body that does not appear in any public record, and set into motion with a patience and a discipline that I still find remarkable when I think about it. Because what humanity decided to do, in response to learning that the most powerful political body in the galaxy had quietly condemned us, was not to protest, not to flee, and not to fight in the open. We decided to build. And we decided to keep building until we had built something that could not be ignored, could not be dismantled, and could not be answered by anything the galaxy had ever seen before. The operation had a name. We called it the scaffold. It began with the shipyards, because the shipyards were the foundation of everything else. Not the ones the Council monitored, the modest construction facilities registered in our treaty disclosures, producing the survey vessels and diplomatic transports and light patrol ships that fit comfortably within the size and capability limits the Council had approved for humanity. Those yards kept operating exactly as they always had, because they needed to. They needed to be exactly what the council expected them to be. The real yards were built somewhere else entirely. 47 facilities, each one constructed inside a hollowed asteroid or a dead planetoid in regions of space that fell between the mapped corridors the Council's survey ships traveled. Each one shielded against every known form of deep space sensor, using techniques that our engineers developed specifically for this purpose over a period of 12 years. Each one staffed by crews who rotated on strict schedules, who communicated through quantum-encrypted channels that ran dark to every external receiver, who knew that the work they were doing was the most important work any human being had ever been assigned, and who never, in 31 years, produced a single significant breach. I have been asked since those events how it was possible to keep a secret of that scale across that span of time. It is a reasonable question. The answer is not complicated. The people who built the scaffold did not think of it as keeping a secret. They thought of it as protecting something. There is a difference in how those two things feel from the inside, and that difference matters when the years stretch long and the work is hard. What came out of those 47 yards over 31 years was the Ares fleet. 1,200 warships, not the patrol frigates and diplomatic escorts in our treaty disclosures, not the light cruisers and science vessels and courier ships that made up our registered military capability. Something different. Something that had been designed by engineers who had studied not how other species built warships, but how humanity had fought wars for 10,000 years, across every terrain and every technology level and every scale of conflict, and who had distilled that entire accumulated history into a set of design principles that no other civilization in the galaxy had ever had reason to develop. Because no other civilization had ever fought as many wars as we had. No other civilization had spent 10 millennia refining the science of overwhelming force. The largest ship in the Ares fleet carried no official designation in any public record. Internally, we called it Mjolnir. It was not a warship in the conventional sense. It was something closer to a weapons platform wrapped around a city, a vessel so large that the smaller ships in the fleet docked inside it the way cargo containers rest in a harbor, tucked into bays along its interior hull. Its crew complement was larger than the population of some of the colony stations in the outer Kepler chain. Its primary weapon system did not have a classification in the Council's threat registry, because the physics it operated on had not existed as a documented phenomenon when the Council's threat registry was last updated. We had developed it ourselves. Our engineers called it cascade collapse induction. What it did, in practical terms, was remove a defined volume of space from the normal state of existence, not destroy what was in that space, not damage it, not displace it. Remove it. The space it had occupied became ordinary space again, as though the object had never been there at all. We had tested it twice, in the deep dark between star systems, on volumes of space large enough to satisfy our confidence in the system, and small enough that the events would not register on anything the Council was monitoring. Both tests were successful. The data was reviewed by 43 independent teams. The conclusions were the same every time. There was nothing in the Council's arsenal, or the arsenal of any species in the Council, that the cascade system could not reach and remove. Now, I want to be careful here about what I record, because what I record will be read and heard and examined for a long time after I am gone. I want the record to be accurate about one thing. We did not build the Ares fleet because we wanted to use it. I have heard the stories that came out of those years, the ones that make humanity sound like a civilization that had been waiting for permission to become a conqueror. Those stories are wrong. Every person who worked on the scaffold, every engineer and crew member and analyst and administrator understood that what they were building was a lock, not a key. They were building it because the door existed, because something was going to come through it eventually. Because the alternative to being ready was being the 12th name on a list that nobody outside the Council's archives would ever read. We built it because we refused to disappear quietly. We built it because Sierra Vance had to walk into that chamber with something real standing behind her words. And we built it because, on the day she turned to a camera no larger than her thumbnail and said, "Let him begin," the people on the other side of that camera needed to be ready. When she gave the word, the scaffold's blackout ended. 47 facilities dropped their sensor shielding simultaneously. 1,200 ships activated their transponders. Mjolnir lit up every receiver in the galaxy like a second sun coming online. For the first time in 31 years, humanity stood up to its full height. And the galaxy, which had never seen it before, went very quiet. The Council's response fleet took 46 hours to do nothing. I had planned for many things in the years leading up to those events. I had wargamed hundreds of scenarios with the best strategic minds humanity had available, running variables and outcomes and response timelines until the simulations blurred together. I had planned for an immediate launch. I had planned for a delayed response designed to allow political maneuvering. I had planned for a coordinated strike from multiple directions, and for a single overwhelming force, and for a blockade strategy, and for a dozen combinations of all of the above. I had not planned for silence. Not tactical silence, not the silence of a fleet moving dark and fast toward an engagement. The silence of a political body that had received information it did not know how to process. The Council's combined armada sat at the edge of the Sol system's sensor shadow for 46 hours and did not advance a single kilometer. Their communication traffic, which our intercept teams were pulling from every frequency they broadcast on, went from organized to fragmented to something that our translators described as argumentative. They were not arguing about tactics. They were arguing about whether to proceed at all. The first sign that something fundamental had shifted came 18 hours into that silence, when the Serenthi delegation transmitted a formal withdrawal from Directive Omega. The Serenthi were the oldest continuous civilization in the Council, 4 million years of unbroken recorded history, and they had never in that time withdrawn from a ratified directive. The text of their withdrawal was brief and precise. They had reviewed the available information regarding the Ares fleet. Their projections indicated that proceeding with Directive Omega would result in consequences they were not prepared to accept. They were removing their forces from the engagement order. 40 minutes later, the PAL withdrew. 2 hours after that, the Vreth Assembly transmitted their withdrawal, and that was the one that changed the arithmetic of the situation in a way that could not be recovered from. The Vreth were the most militarily capable species in the Council. Their armada represented nearly a quarter of the total force that had been assembled for the engagement. When they pulled out, they did not do so quietly. Their withdrawal message was direct. They had modeled 700 engagement scenarios. In none of those scenarios did the Council achieve a decisive result without sustaining losses that their leadership was unwilling to accept. They had joined the Council to maintain galactic stability, not to absorb catastrophic damage in service of a directive they were no longer confident was achievable. They were withdrawing. 3 species gone. The Council's consensus engine, which had operated without a significant fracture in 60,000 years, began showing fault lines that our analysts could track in real time through the communication intercepts. Species that had voted yes less than 3 days earlier were quietly repositioning their fleets away from the engagement corridor. Not retreating, not yet, but creating distance, creating options, creating the physical space to make a different choice if the situation continued to develop in the direction it was developing. Sierra, meanwhile, was no longer in the Council's custody. She had walked out of the Chamber of Accord 14 minutes after the vote. Through a door that opened because the human maintenance technicians who had serviced that wing of the building for the past 6 years had spent those years doing something other than standard maintenance. She had passed 4 security checkpoints without incident because the humans staffing those checkpoints as contracted support personnel had been waiting for exactly this moment. She had reached a private docking bay deep in the station's lower levels and boarded a courier ship that, according to the Council's docking records, did not exist. The lockdown order was issued 11 minutes after she cleared the station's outer perimeter. By then, she was 30 light minutes away and accelerating hard toward a transit point that our navigation teams had mapped and pre-cleared 18 months in advance. She arrived aboard Mjolnir 4 hours before I expected her. I was in the main briefing room when she came through the door, still wearing her ambassador's formal whites, which were immaculate in a way that seemed almost unreasonable given everything she had just moved through. She looked at the tactical display running the current positions of the Council fleet and the Ares fleet and the 3 species that had already withdrawn. She looked at it for about 10 seconds. Then she sat down across from me and asked one question. "How long before we can be at Velsora?" I told her. She nodded once, exactly the way she had nodded at the camera in the Chamber of Accord. "Then let's not make them wait. I want to record what that felt like, because I think the record should contain it. There are moments in large events, moments that only last a few seconds, when you become aware that you are standing inside something that will be described and analyzed and argued about long after everyone present is gone. I had felt it twice before in my career, both times in the middle of engagements that turned out to be decisive. It is not a comfortable feeling. It does not feel like triumph or confidence. It feels like weight, like the future pressing down on the present with everything it contains. I felt it in that briefing room, watching Sierra Vance study the tactical display. I gave the order for the Ares fleet to set course for Velsara. The Council's remaining fleet, minus the 3 species that had already withdrawn, was still sitting at the edge of the Sol system's sensor shadow when our transponders showed our change of course. The communication intercept spiked immediately, a sudden burst of traffic across every frequency, species talking to species in the kind of rapid back and forth that our translators flagged as urgent. Our course change had answered the question they had been trying to avoid asking themselves. We were not waiting to be attacked. We were coming to them. There is a specific quality to the silence that falls over a bridge crew when something happens that has no precedent. I have commanded ships through engagements where people were afraid, and afraid people are loud in their own way. They breathe too quickly. They speak in clipped bursts. They move with a controlled tension that fills a space with a kind of compressed energy. I knew that silence. I had grown up in it. What settled over Mjolnir's bridge as we approached Velsara was different. It was the silence of people who were trying to process something that did not fit inside any framework they had previously been given. It was the silence of witnesses. Velsara was the Council's capital, the seat of its government, the location of the Chamber of Accord, and the administrative heart of a political body that had governed galactic affairs for 60,000 years. As a physical location, it was extraordinary. The station itself was larger than most moons, a structure that had been built in layers over the course of millennia, each era of construction visible in the architecture if you knew what you were looking at. It was surrounded at all times by a defensive fleet, whose composition and capability was classified even from most council members. When we dropped out of transit and the main display resolved the situation ahead of us, I ran the count 3 times before I believed it. The defensive fleet was still there. The Council's remaining armada, the ships that had stayed after the 3 withdrawals, had pulled back to Velsara and joined with the permanent garrison. It was a significant force, significantly smaller than it had been when Directive Omega was issued, but not small. They had positioned themselves in a layered defensive arrangement around the station, a formation that our tactical analysts had seen before in Council military doctrine. It was a standard maximum defense configuration. It was designed to absorb an attack. We had not come to attack. I want to be precise about this, because the distinction matters enormously for how what followed is understood. The Ares fleet arrived at Velsora not in a combat approach, not dark, not at engagement speed with weapons ready. We arrived in full broadcast, every ship transmitting openly, in a wide formation that was clearly not designed for immediate engagement. We were visible. We were announced. We were impossible to misread as anything other than what we were. A civilization that had come to have a conversation. The transmission we broadcast on arrival went out on every frequency and in every language the Council used, and it carried Sira's voice. The Galactic Council issued Directive Omega against humanity. We are here to discuss the terms of its withdrawal. You have 1 hour. That was the entire message. No threats embedded in it, no list of consequences, no ultimatum beyond the time limit, just a statement of fact and a window of opportunity. The hour passed. No response came. I looked at Sira. She was standing to my right, slightly behind the main tactical console, her hands folded in front of her. She had stood that way for most of the approach, watching the display, not speaking unless she had something specific to add. She was not anxious. She was not performing calm. She was simply present in the way that some people are able to be present in extraordinary moments, fully there, fully aware, without the noise that anxiety or excitement produces. She looked at the display for another few seconds after the hour expired. Then she tilted her head slightly toward the viewport. She did not say anything. She did not need to. I turned to the weapons station. Target the primary communications relay array, I said. Cascade system, full range, fire on my mark. The relay array was 4 kilometers of quantum-entangled hardware. It was the nervous system of the Council's communications network, the structure through which every signal between member species was routed and authenticated and recorded. It had taken, by the Council's own archived records, 200 years to build. It had been in continuous operation for 60,000 years. It was, in practical terms, the infrastructure through which a civilization of 47 species maintained the connections that made it function as a single political body. Mark, I said. The cascade system fired once. The array ceased to exist. Not in an explosion, not in a burst of energy or a cascade of visible destruction. The space it occupied simply became ordinary space, exactly as our engineers had always described it would. One moment the array was there, 4 kilometers of the most sophisticated communications hardware in the known galaxy, and then it was not. The space it had occupied looked no different from the space around it. There was no wreckage. There was no debris field. There was nothing at all. I watched the Council fleet's response on the tactical display. It did not attack. It did not retreat. For 4 minutes and 17 seconds, which I counted precisely because I needed something concrete to focus on, the entire defensive formation held completely still. Not the stillness of a force preparing to engage. The stillness of a force that had stopped functioning as an organized military unit and become, instead, a collection of individual ships whose commanders were trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Then the Kareth flagship opened a channel. The Kareth Dominion was the most militarily powerful species remaining in the Council after the 3 withdrawals. Their flagship, the vessel that anchored the defensive formation, was a ship whose dimensions I had always found difficult to process as a real object. It was as large as some of the smaller moons in our outer solar system. It had been in continuous service for 300 years and had never, in that time, been on the losing side of a conflict. The voice that came through the channel was the flagship's commanding officer. I do not know the Kareth system for ranks or titles. I know only that when this individual spoke, the fleet held still and listened. The question asked was short. What else can that weapon reach? I answered honestly. Everything. The silence that followed was not the silence of the bridge. It was the silence of a fleet. It stretched for 6 full minutes on the display timer, and during those 6 minutes, Not a single ship in the Council's defensive formation moved. Then the Kareth flagship began to turn. It did not turn quickly. A ship of that scale does not turn quickly. It moved with the slow, deliberate motion of something massive changing its relationship to the space around it. And as it turned, the ships around it began to turn as well, one by one, and then in groups, the formation dissolving not in rout but in the careful, considered movement of a force making a decision. The Battle of Vel Sora lasted 22 minutes from our arrival to the moment the last Council vessel cleared the system. Mjolnir fired its primary weapon once. No ships were destroyed. No crews were lost on either side. By any measure of what a battle is supposed to look like, almost nothing happened. And yet, when the final Council ship disappeared from the tactical display, Mjolnir's bridge went from silence to noise, in a way that I could feel in my chest. Not shouting, nothing undisciplined, just the release of 31 years of weight lifting from a crew that had carried it so long they had stopped noticing the pressure of it. I felt my hands unclench from the edge of the console, where I had apparently placed them sometime during the preceding 22 minutes without being aware of it. I looked at Sira. She was looking at the now empty space on the display where the Council fleet had been. "They'll come back," she said quietly, "eventually." "I know," I said. "We should be ready for that conversation too." "Yes," I said, "we should." Then she turned away from the display, and I watched something happen to her face that I had not seen happen before in all the years I had known her. The composure did not break. It never broke. But it softened, just briefly, in the way that things soften when the moment they have been built to withstand finally passes. She walked to the back of the bridge and stood at the viewport. I let her have that moment. She had earned it more thoroughly than anyone I had ever met. I am recording this 3 days after Vel Sora. Mjolnir is in a holding position above Earth's orbital plane. The Ares fleet is dispersed across the inner system, not in defensive formation but not stood down either, in the position we call a watchful rest, present and capable, and not currently aimed at anything. The Council has not communicated with us since the Kareth flagship departed Vel Sora. Our intercept teams report that the Council's internal communications traffic is at the highest volume ever recorded, which our analysts are treating as a positive indicator. Entities that are planning immediate aggressive action generally do not talk this much first. Directive Omega has not been formally rescinded. I want the record to be accurate about that. Humanity is still, by the Council's legal framework, under an active extinction order. The order simply has not been carried out, and the fleet that was assembled to carry it out has dispersed to its component systems, and 3 of the most powerful species in the Council have formally withdrawn from participation in it. What that means in practice, and what it will mean in the months and years ahead, is not something I am able to determine from where I am sitting. What I can tell you is what I know. And what I know is that humanity went into that chamber through the front door, in full view of 47 civilizations, and we walked back out again. I found Sira last night on the ship's forward observation deck. It is a wide room at the forward end of the ship's upper section, enclosed by a curved, transparent panel that looks out into open space. At our current position, Earth is visible from that panel as a small, bright object, recognizable by its color if you know what you are looking at. I have stood at that panel many times in the past 3 days, looking at it, thinking about what it means that it is still there. Sira was already there when I arrived. She was standing close to the panel, not touching it, looking out. She was still wearing the formal white she had worn in the Chamber of Accord. I had begun to wonder if she had any other clothes on the ship. I sat on the bench behind her. She did not turn around. We stayed that way for a while. I do not know how long. Long enough for the light from the observation panel to change as the ship completed a slow rotation in its holding position. Eventually, I asked her the question I had been carrying since I watched her stand at the Council's podium. I asked her what she had been thinking during those 12 seconds of silence, before she spoke, before she said anything at all, when she was standing there with the vote already recorded and 47 species watching her, what had been in her mind. She did not answer immediately. I had expected that. Sira processed things at her own pace, and she never spoke before she was ready, which was one of the qualities that had made her extraordinary at her work and occasionally frustrating to the people around her. When she finally answered, she did not turn from the viewport. "I was thinking about my grandmother," she said. Her voice was quiet and even, the voice she used when she was telling the truth about something that mattered. She used to say that the bravest thing a person can do is walk into a room where they have already decided you do not belong and make them regret the decision. She paused. I figured that scaled. I looked at her for a moment, then I laughed. I should note for the record that I am not a person who laughs easily. My crew would attest to this with some enthusiasm, I suspect. In the years I have commanded ships and led operations and sat through briefings that described consequences I was responsible for preventing, laughter has not been a frequent response. It is not that I lack the capacity for it. It is that very few things, in the circumstances I generally find myself in, produce that particular feeling. What Sira said produced it. Fully, unexpectedly, from somewhere that had been compressed and held and waiting through 31 years and a vote in a mountain-sized chamber, and a fleet that I had never been certain would be enough, and a weapon that I had never been certain we would need to use. It came out all at once and surprised both of us. She turned around when she heard it. She looked at me with an expression that was as close to amused as I had ever seen on her face, which was not very close to amused as most people would define it, but close enough for Sira Vance. "That is the first time I have heard you do that," she said. "It has been a long 31 years, I said. She considered that. "Yes," she said, "it has." She moved away from the viewport and sat down on the bench at a distance that was close but not quite next to me. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then she looked at her hands in her lap, and then she looked up again at the observation panel and at Earth, small and bright and still there. "What happens now?" she asked, not because she did not have her own ideas about the answer. Sira always had ideas about everything. She asked it in the way that people ask questions they have already partially answered for themselves, to hear the answer spoken aloud and see if it matches what they have worked out internally. "Negotiations," I said, "eventually, when they are ready." "And if they are not ready?" "Then we wait," I said. "We are very good at waiting. We have demonstrated that." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the nearest thing to it I had heard from her in 3 days. 31 years is a compelling argument for patience," she said. "We also have 1,200 ships," I said. "Yes," she said, "that helps." We sat in the quiet of the observation deck for a long time after that. The ship turned slowly in its holding position, and Earth moved across the arc of the viewport, and I watched it go by and thought about all the things that the word Earth contained. The 10,000 years of history that had produced us, all the conflicts and recoveries and catastrophes survived, and technologies developed, and ideas discovered and lost and rediscovered again. Every war that should have ended us and did not. Every extinction-level event we had looked at directly and decided, collectively and individually, that we were going to get through it, because the alternative was not acceptable, and humanity has never been comfortable accepting alternatives that it has not exhausted every option to avoid. I thought about the people in the scaffold, working in the dark for 3 decades, shielded from the galaxy behind sensor arrays and encrypted channels, and the quiet discipline of a shared purpose so large that speaking it aloud too often might have made it seem impossible. I thought about the engineers who designed a weapon that removed space itself from the normal order of things, working from physics that had never been documented because we were the only civilization that had needed to discover it. I thought about the crew of Mjolnir and the 1,200 ships of the Ares fleet, and the ordinary humans on Earth, who did not know the full scope of what had been built in the dark on their behalf, but who had, in their daily lives and their daily choices, produced the civilization that made all of it possible. And I thought about Cira Vance, standing at a podium in a chamber that swallowed sound, in front of 47 civilizations that had already decided, saying the words she needed to say, and then turning to a camera the size of her thumbnail to give the signal that started everything. Not afraid, not defeated, not asking for mercy. Just informing them, just making sure they understood what they had started. I am not a person who uses the word legend lightly. I have spent my career dealing in facts, in verified information, in documented events with confirmed sources. But I am going to write this into the record and let future readers decide what to do with it. There is a woman in a white coat who stood in the most powerful room in the known galaxy and looked 47 civilizations in the eye and told them they had made a mistake. And then she turned to a camera no one was supposed to know was there, and she gave 6 words to the people waiting on the other side of it, and 1,000 ships answered. That is what she was, that is what we were. We are not a civilization you approach with a verdict already written and expect to sit quietly while it is read. We are not a species that calculates the odds of survival and concludes that the odds are prohibitive and accepts the result. We are not built that way. We were never built that way. Every war we survived made us stronger. Every catastrophe we endured changed us but did not end us. Every time something looked at us from across whatever divide separated us and decided that we were not worth the trouble of understanding, we proved it wrong, not through argument, not through appeal, but through the simple, stubborn, deeply human act of still being here. The Galactic Council ordered humanity's destruction. They sent their fleet to the edge of our solar system, and the fleet did not advance. They issued a directive with 47 votes behind it, and 3 of those 47 have already removed their names. They came expecting to find a civilization that would not fight, or a civilization that would fight and be overwhelmed, and instead they found a civilization that had spent 31 years preparing for precisely this moment, that had built in the dark and waited in the quiet, and sent one woman to stand in their chamber and look them in the eye. Directive Omega has not been rescinded. The conversation is not over. I do not know what comes next with the certainty I would prefer. But Earth is still there, small and bright in the observation panel, holding its position around its star the way it has for 4 billion years, patient in the way that only very old things are patient, waiting for whatever comes next. Cira is looking at it too. We were built for exactly this. We were built by every generation that came before us and refused to stop. We were built by every person who walked into a room where they had already decided and made them regret the decision. We are still here. Let the galaxy learn our name. We already know theirs.